What if the moment your bank account dropped below a certain number, your ability to think clearly began to shrink? Not metaphorically, literally. Psychologists have studied this for decades, and what they found is something most people are never told. Because if you knew, certain industries, certain systems, certain people in very powerful positions would lose something they depend on. Your desperation. Hold on to that thought because by the end of this, you will never look at financial stress the same way again. We are living inside one of the most psychologically charged economic climates in modern American history. Rent is up, groceries cost more than they did 3 years ago, credit card debt just hit a record high, savings rates are near historic lows, and somewhere between the news headlines and the notification that your account balance dropped again, something is quietly happening inside the human mind. Something that nobody in power is rushing to explain to you. Because economic uncertainty does not just make life harder. It makes people easier to control. That is not a theory, that is not a conspiracy, that is psychology, and once you understand the mechanism behind it, you will start to see the fingerprints of it everywhere. In advertising, in politics, in your relationships, in the content you consume at night when the anxiety will not let you sleep. This is not about blaming anyone, this is about understanding what is happening inside you, so that something outside of you cannot use it against you. Let us begin. There is a concept in behavioral economics called scarcity mindset. It was studied deeply by researchers and what they discovered is genuinely unsettling. When people experience scarcity, whether it is money, time, food, or resources, the human brain does not just feel stressed. It fundamentally changes how it processes information. The mind tunnels. It fixates on the immediate problem, the overdue bill, the empty fridge, the paycheck that is still 4 days away, and while the brain is locked onto that one thing, everything else blurs. Long-term planning becomes nearly impossible. Emotional regulation weakens. The ability to evaluate risk and reward deteriorates. Psychologists call this bandwidth tax. Think of your mind like a phone with limited processing power. When scarcity consumes the foreground, the background functions slow down, creativity, patience, skepticism, critical thinking, all of it gets quietly throttled. And here is what makes this disturbing. Scarcity mindset does not just affect people who are poor. It affects anyone who is experiencing the feeling of not having enough, even temporarily. Even just the fear of not having enough in the future is enough to trigger it. In modern America, that describes tens of millions of people right now. And a mind in tunnel vision is a mind that is far easier to guide. But this is only the beginning. Let us talk about something called the threat response, because this is where the psychology becomes truly dangerous. When the human brain perceives a threat, the amygdala activates. You have probably heard of fight or flight. What most people do not fully understand is what that state does to higher reasoning. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for logic, long-term thinking, and impulse control, gets partially suppressed. In a survival state, the brain does not want you to sit and analyze. It wants you to react fast. Now imagine a society where millions of people are operating in a low-grade, chronic version of this state every single day. Not because of a physical predator, but because of financial anxiety. The constant background hum of economic pressure. They are not in full panic, but they are not thinking clearly either. They are in a kind of in-between zone, stressed enough to be reactive, calm enough to think they are reasoning normally. And that zone is exactly where manipulation is most effective. Because a mind that feels urgency is a mind that wants answers fast. Fast answers do not come from deep thinking, they come from whoever is speaking loudest, whoever sounds most certain, whoever offers the simplest explanation for the pain. Have you ever noticed how much angrier political discourse gets during economic downturns? How new financial products, supplements, courses, and schemes explode in popularity when people are struggling? How people who seemed reasonable suddenly start following voices they never would have trusted before. That is not weakness, that is neuroscience. Here is where it gets darker. There is an entire science built around this vulnerability, and it is not being studied to protect you from it. In marketing, it is called fear-based advertising. In politics, it is called threat framing. In personal relationships, it is called manufactured insecurity, but the mechanism is identical across all three. Create or amplify the feeling of threat, then offer yourself as the solution. Think about how many financial products are sold in this country, not by explaining their actual value, but by first making you feel like you are behind, like you are failing, like everyone else has figured out something you have not. The ad does not start with a product. It starts with a mirror showing you your worst fear about yourself. You are not saving enough. You are one medical bill away from disaster. You will never retire. Your kids will inherit your debt. Once that fear is activated, the critical thinking that would normally evaluate whether this product actually works is suppressed, and in its place is something much simpler. Relief seeking. You are no longer buying a product. You are buying the feeling that the fear might go away. Psychology suggests that people under financial stress make purchasing decisions based on emotional relief far more than rational analysis. The irony is devastating. The people who can least afford to make bad financial decisions are the most psychologically vulnerable to doing exactly that. Most people never notice this next part. Let us talk about social comparison and how economic uncertainty weaponizes it. Humans are deeply social creatures. We have always measured our status and safety partly through comparison with others. In a stable, tight-knit community, that comparison is grounded. You can see your neighbors, you understand your context. But in the age of social media, that comparison engine has been hijacked. On platforms designed to maximize engagement, the content that spreads fastest is content that triggers the strongest emotional response. And few things trigger emotion faster than social status comparison. So the average American, already stressed about money, opens their phone and scrolls through a carefully curated feed of people who appear wealthier, more successful, more put together. They are not seeing reality, they are seeing performance, filtered, edited, sometimes outright fabricated versions of prosperity. But the brain does not fully distinguish between perceived social reality and actual social reality. And so the stress compounds, the scarcity mindset deepens, the feeling of falling behind intensifies. And a person who feels they are losing ground will grasp at things they otherwise never would. Research has shown that social comparison under conditions of scarcity dramatically increases impulsive financial behavior. People buy things they cannot afford to signal status. They follow financial advice from strangers online. They take risks that their stable, clear-minded selves would immediately reject. The manipulation does not even have to be intentional. The system itself, the algorithm, the feed, the endless scroll, creates the psychological conditions for it automatically. What if this is happening to you right now? Not because you are naive, not because you are weak, but because the environment has been carefully shaped to put pressure on exactly the parts of your mind that are hardest to defend when the pressure hits. Let us go deeper. There is a phenomenon called learned helplessness. It was first studied in the context of animals, then applied to humans, and the implications are deeply uncomfortable. When a person experiences repeated negative outcomes that they feel they cannot control, they stop trying to change them, even when the opportunity to change actually appears. They have learned on a psychological level that their actions do not matter. Now think about how economic messaging in this country often operates. The housing market is impossible. The economy is rigged. Student loans are a trap with no exit. Healthcare will bankrupt you regardless of what you do. Some of this is true. Some of it is exaggerated. But the consistent message, repeated across news cycles, social media, and everyday conversation, is that the individual is powerless against forces too large to understand. And a person who feels powerless is a person who becomes dependent. Dependent on whoever seems to have the answers. Dependent on whoever offers certainty inside the chaos. Dependent on whoever says, "Follow me, trust me, I will handle what you cannot." That dependency is not weakness. That is a predictable, documented psychological response to prolonged exposure to chaos and helplessness. But it is also a doorway. And throughout history, it is a doorway that has been walked through by movements, leaders, and institutions that did not have people's best interests in mind. Let us talk about something that most financial and psychological experts rarely discuss together. The relationship between economic stress and identity. When money becomes scarce, something subtle but profound shifts in how people see themselves. The self-concept, that internal story we tell about who we are and what we are worth, begins to fracture. In America particularly, there is a deeply embedded cultural belief that financial success is a reflection of personal value. That if you are struggling, something is wrong with you. That stability equals worthiness. When that belief meets economic reality, the psychological damage is severe. Because now it is not just your bank account that feels threatened. It is you. And a person whose sense of self is under threat is one of the most manipulable states a human being can occupy. They will follow charismatic figures who restore their sense of identity. They will join communities, movements, or ideologies that offer them a group to belong to and a story that explains their struggle in a way that preserves their dignity. They will consume content that reflects their pain and sells them a version of themselves that has overcome it. This is why certain voices explode in popularity during economic downturns. They are not just offering financial advice or political opinions. They are offering identity reconstruction. And identity, once emotionally attached to a source, is very hard to separate from it, even when the source begins to take more than it gives. Here is something you almost never hear discussed directly. Stress changes memory. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, consistent way that affects how you process experience over time. Under chronic stress, the hippocampus, the part of the brain involved in memory formation and retrieval, is affected by elevated cortisol levels. What this means practically is that people under prolonged economic stress often find it harder to accurately recall the past, harder to project clearly into the future, and more anchored in the emotional intensity of the present moment. Think about what that means for manipulation. A person who cannot clearly remember the last time they were deceived is more vulnerable to being deceived again. A person who cannot clearly imagine a stable future, cannot plan toward one, they are stuck in a kind of perpetual now. And in that perpetual now, whoever is speaking to them in the present moment has enormous influence. The advertiser, the political voice, the online personality, the partner who controls the finances, the employer who holds the contract. They all become disproportionately powerful when the mind has lost its grip on past and future. Psychology suggests that one of the most protective factors against manipulation is time perspective, the ability to connect your present decisions to your past patterns and your future consequences. Economic stress systematically erodes that protection. We need to talk about relationships, because this is where the psychological impact of economic uncertainty gets most personal, and in many cases most dangerous. Financial stress is one of the leading causes of relationship conflict in America. That is well documented. But what is less discussed is how it creates power imbalances inside relationships that can become vectors for control. When one person in a relationship holds more financial stability than the other, the dynamic shifts, sometimes subtly, sometimes not subtly at all. The person with less financial security often begins to modify their behavior to preserve the relationship. They stay quiet about things that bother them. They accept conditions they would not have accepted before. They reshape their needs around the other person's comfort. This is not always malicious on either side. Sometimes it is simply the natural gravity of financial dependency. But in cases where the more financially stable partner is willing to exploit that dynamic consciously, the result is economic abuse, and it is far more common than most people acknowledge. And it does not only happen in romantic relationships, it happens in workplaces, where an employer knows that employees are struggling and uses that to demand more, offer less, and punish any sign of resistance. In communities, where financial gatekeepers decide who gets access and who does not based on loyalty to a particular structure or set of beliefs. In families, where inherited financial dependency keeps adult children from ever fully separating psychologically from parents who use money as a mechanism of control. Economic uncertainty does not create these dynamics from nothing, but it intensifies them. It deepens the leverage that already exists and creates new leverage where none existed before. Have you ever noticed how easy it becomes to believe something when you desperately need it to be true? That is the climax of everything we have been building toward. There is a psychological state that researchers sometimes describe as motivated reasoning under threat. It is the tendency, when we are frightened and desperate, to accept information not because it is logical or evidence-based, but because it gives us relief from the fear. Under normal circumstances, most people apply at least some skepticism to what they hear. They question sources, they notice inconsistencies, they weigh competing explanations. But when economic terror is constant, when the stress is chronic and the uncertainty feels endless, the brain begins to trade accuracy for comfort. And this is the darkest truth in everything we have covered today. The mind will accept a false sense of control over the unbearable weight of genuine uncertainty. Meaning, it is not that people become stupid during economic hardship. It is that they become desperate. And desperation has a gravity that pulls people toward whoever or whatever promises to end the feeling. Charismatic figures who offer simple, certain explanations for complex suffering. Financial schemes that promise dramatic escape from the grind. Ideologies that provide a clear enemy to blame and a clear tribe to belong to. Health and wellness products marketed as the thing standing between you and total collapse. All of it thrives in the same psychological soil. A mind under pressure. A person who is exhausted from uncertainty and ready to hand the steering wheel to someone who sounds like they know where they are going. And here is what makes it nearly invisible to the person experiencing it. When you are in that state, you do not feel like you are being manipulated. You feel like you are finally waking up. Like you finally found the truth. Like you finally found the person or the movement or the product that understands what you have been going through. It feels like clarity. But in many cases, it is the opposite. So what do you do with this? Because awareness without application is just anxiety with extra steps. The first thing to understand is that knowing this exists is not the same as being immune to it. Nobody is. The psychological mechanisms we have discussed operate on hardware that is millions of years old. They cannot be switched off by willpower or intelligence. But they can be disrupted by awareness. Research has shown that simply numbing the state you are in reduces its power over your decisions. When you feel financial panic rising, when the tunnel vision starts, when you feel that desperate pull toward a quick answer or a simple certainty, numbing it as a psychological response rather than an objective reality creates just enough distance to think. This is not the answer, this is the panic looking for an answer. That single reframe does not solve your financial situation, but it may stop you from making it worse through a decision driven by manufactured urgency. The second thing, be intensely suspicious of anything that begins by amplifying your fear and ends by selling you something. Whether that something is a product, a political loyalty and identity, or a worldview. The sequence matters. Fear first, then solution. That sequence is almost never in your interest. The third thing, protect your time perspective. Deliberately. When stress collapses your sense of past and future into an overwhelming present, counteract it. Write down 3 decisions you regret from a previous period of stress. Write down what your life looked like 3 years ago versus now. Write down what you actually want 3 years from now. Not because planning is magical, but because reconnecting to timeline is one of the most powerful cognitive tools against manipulation. And finally, understand that the system that profits from your economic anxiety is not going to explain any of this to you. That is not cynicism. That is simply an observation about incentive structures. The advertising industry profits from insecurity. The content industry profits from fear-driven engagement. Certain political systems profit from populations that are too exhausted and too fragmented to organize effectively. None of these forces are going to hand you the manual to their own disruption. But you are reading it right now. Economic uncertainty is not just a financial condition. It is a psychological one. And in that psychological condition, invisible forces move with remarkable ease. They move through the advertising you barely register, through the content that seems to understand your pain, through the relationships where money has quietly become power, through the political voices that seem to offer certainty inside the chaos. They are not all malicious. Many of them are simply opportunistic. Systems following their own logic, people following their own incentives, algorithms optimizing for the metrics they were designed to maximize. But the effect on the person living inside it is the same. A narrowed mind, a reactive heart, a desperate reaching for something solid in a world that keeps shifting beneath their feet. You are not weak for experiencing this. You are humans. But now you know what is happening. And a person who understands the mechanism of their own vulnerability is a person who is significantly harder to use. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it.